Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's Florida-friendly webinar for homeowners. Today, we are joined by Professor Hostetler. We're going to be talking about birds. My name is Claire Mitchell. I am the education manager for the Florida-friendly landscaping program statewide in the state office, and we are thrilled to have everybody here today. We got a lot of people. It's going to be a popular webinar. We're talking about birds. I want to hear what's your favorite bird to see in your landscape. I'll start off by saying my son just discovered the Merlin app, and every morning, as soon as he wakes up, he gets dad's phone or the iPad, and he puts it on the porch, and he wants to see how many birds he can hear in our neighborhood, and it's consistently in the 40s, and he gets really excited about hearing if there's a swallowtail kite. So that will be my favorite one, even though I don't know what that even sounds like. So we got, brown thrashers. Favorite bird is, we got a loggerhead shrike in Hillsborough County, downy woodpeckers, blue-gray gnatcatchers. Love seeing all of these as well. Chickadees, kestrels, scrub jays. Wow, everyone's really excited about birds. This is a lot of examples. We got red-headed woodpeckers and cardinals and blue jays. My goodness. Ooh, sandhill cranes. Ooh, yeah, I also love hearing sandhill cranes. That's how you know winter's over. They're going home. Oh my gosh, someone said northern parula. There was a northern parula that kept flying right up to our window and just like hovering at our window. We thought maybe it was seeing its reflection and looking for another parula in our window. Eastern bluebird, hummingbird. Somebody only sees a mockingbird and it's chased all the bluebirds away. Oh boy. Okay, and somebody's saying they're not seeing a lot of birds, so hopefully we're going to change this after this webinar today. Mark, what's your favorite one to see in your yard, or do you have like a top five or three?
Oh no, it depends on my mood, really. I like all birds, the small and the large ones. Right now, I have some red-shouldered hawks nesting in a live oak above my house, and they're quite entertaining, bringing in various items of prey every morning.
I bet that's an exciting way to start your day for sure. See what they caught today. Um, okay, everybody. Okay, I'll read like a couple more. We got people like cedar waxwings, painted bunting. That's really exciting to see. We rarely see those in Gainesville, but I know that they are residents in other parts of the state, and you guys are lucky. All right, I guess we're gonna get started. So I'm gonna get started with my little script here to introduce and welcome everybody. So this is the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program's homeowner webinar series. This series is given every third Tuesday of the month at 11 a.m. And as I said before, my name is Claire Mitchell. I'm the statewide education manager for FFL. And today we have Dr. Mark Hostetler, who will speak with us about how to attract more birds to your landscape. So right now, your microphones are muted. If you have questions, we're going to use the Q&A box because the chat box is about to be closed. And we'll answer any of your questions at the end of the presentation. So you can stick around to the end. We're actually going to have two surveys today. Dr. Hostetler has his own survey that really helps him with his reporting and his research. And we also have an exit survey for our webinar. So that just helps us improve our programming and lets us know how we're doing. Our next webinar will be June 16th at 11 a.m. and we'll be joined by Michael Orphanides, the commercial horticulture extension agent in Broward County. And he's going to be talking to us about landscape prep for hurricane season because hurricane season is already next month, which is wild. Okay, so today, as I said, we will be talking with Dr. Mark Hostetler. He is a professor and extension specialist in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation. His work focuses on urban ecology, wildlife conservation, and sustainable community design, helping planners, homeowners, and policymakers enhance biodiversity and natural resource stewardship in cities and neighborhoods. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today, and take it away.
Thank you, Claire. Welcome everyone to this webinar. Usually, whenever I'm doing public speaking, I start off with a dad joke. And so here you are. Y'all can't laugh or moan because I can't hear you. When does a joke become a dad joke? When it becomes apparent.
Ha
All
ha ha
right.
ha. I'll laugh for everybody.
All right. I've been working over the past, well, now it's been 25 years at University of Florida on how you design and manage neighborhoods and cities for biodiversity, in particular for birds and also for insects, as you'll find out. And so today I'm going to first talk a little bit about the Wildlife Cooperative Extension Service, who we are. Then I'm going to get into the meat of the talk about landscaping for birds and the design process. Talk a few about some recent bird studies that have been conducted in Florida. It shows some promising results about how little things can attract even interior forest specialists, and I'll talk about what that means in a second. And then I'm going to talk about how, in many cases, for some of our larger species, it's not enough only to do your backyard, but you need your neighbors to go along with certain practices. And I'll talk about the neighborhood natural area network and how you could join your neighborhood or your where you're living into this network to find out more information about how you can promote wildlife habitat. So, the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation we're statewide. We have specialists not only in Gainesville, like myself, but in various corners of Florida. And we do many things in regarding wildlife. We advise the public, we develop educational programs, we have many different ways to disseminate information, not only through webinars, but also through like EDIS, which is a fact sheet, online downloadable information place for people to get all the research that we do. We try to translate it in a way that public can digest it. So you can find landscaping for wildlife, conservation and management of wildlife issues, and also in particular human wildlife conflict and those darn squirrels eating the seed from your bird feeder. And we have detailed information on species and a variety of wildlife education programs. And you can get most of the information from the extension site. It says wec.ufl.edu. You can call your local extension office. There's a lot of people that's like the front door to UF in a county. And there's also our partner, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, who also does a lot of regulatory and also informational types of programs about wildlife in Florida. So, turn that off. Um, so to get through the basics, what animals need, they all need food, cover, water, and space, and that's what makes up habitat. So if you can provide all those things, you can get a variety of birds, everything from a yellow rump warbler in the winter to a red-tailed hawk, which is one of our larger hawks here in Florida. So if you're thinking about the stages of a bird, you have the egg, and then they hatch into a baby bird, and then become a mature adult, and then they become a reproductive adult, and then they lay more eggs. So at these different stages, sometimes they require different types of habitat. And also, many of our birds that occur in Florida, they occur at different times of the year. So you have the breeding season, the wintering season, and the migration season. Some birds only appear for 2 or 3 weeks at a time in Florida, but they use backyards as what we call stopover habitat. They need to refuel as they go on from the south to the north or the north to the south. So here's an example. If you ever look up a wren, like this house wren here, you see that it summers nowhere near Florida, up north. It's doing its breeding, but it does winter here. So right now, you're not going to be able to see the house wren, but during the winter, you would be able to see this bird. And here are some examples of some residential species. These are species that occur all year round, like the Carolina chickadee, the screech owl, the tufted titmouse, and the northern mockingbird. And here are some species that do different things, like the American redstart passes through Florida. You only see them for 2 to 3 week periods in the spring and the fall. The red-eye vireo breeds in Florida but doesn't winter in Florida. And the American goldfinch winters in Florida but doesn't breed in Florida. So you can have different species occur in your backyard depending on their life history characteristics. And people talk about the sandhill cranes. They're like, well, right now, the greater sandhill crane, which is a close relative of the Florida subspecies of the sandhill crane, they're gone. They've migrated north to into the breeding grounds, but everyone is aware when they come back because they're so numerous. But we do have a subspecies here, and if you see sandhill cranes now, it's particularly with chicks, that is a Florida subspecies. You can't really tell the difference between the two. Florida subspecies is a little bit smaller, but I mean they're pretty large birds. You can't tell unless they're right next to each other. So your backyard or front yard can serve as a breeding site, a wintering site, a stopover site, and even a dispersal site. Even those that are breeding, they need to disperse from the breeding natal area into other areas. And how you design your yards can help for that dispersing of these birds. And as that ruby-throated hummingbird that landed on his shoulder, different species may appear in your yard at different times of the year. So the ruby-throats are back, they're breeding, but then they migrate in winter. And if you're in the southern tip of Florida, sometimes they're there all year round. So how can you provide habitat for all these different species? Well, remember, go back to the four parts of wildlife habitat. First one is food. And I've always encouraged a more natural type of food source. So many different species, even the ones that eat seed primarily, like cardinals, do eat and need insects. And you need to provide habitat for insects. So you can think of the great crested flycatcher that's here breeding in Florida right now, the yellow warbler, the hairy woodpecker. All of these need insects to survive and to feed their young. So really, insect habitat equals bird habitat. So how do you get insects? Well, plant native species. There's many native species and insects in Florida are adapted to this. I like to give the example of oleander. Oleander is an exotic species. It has a milky substance that's toxic, so not many species utilize that plant. There's an exotic oleander moth that does, but besides that, there's very few species that utilize oleanders. And in fact, if you watch oleander flowering, when they flower, there's very few insects and bees around it because it doesn't produce much nectar. You can save dead trees, which I call snags, and you can cut those off so they're not a danger to your house because those woodpeckers require those type of trees to forage on grubs and other insects. Reducing pesticide use, you can use alternative methods of insect control. You can spot treat, just a blanket spraying of pesticides eliminates all insects that are the food base for most birds in Florida. And what I really think is very important is to reduce the amount of mowed lawn. So mowed lawn is sort of like concrete to most birds. I mean, some birds use it, of course, but design more islands of wild areas. Rewild it. Try to get that structure that's not mowed grass to more vertical height structure. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Other ways you can kind of mimic those birds that like insects is during the winter you can sock peanut butter or suet. You can provide seed for the seed feeders. They're natural seeds like the sweet gum balls, um, or you can provide black oiled sunflower seed. Almost all species will eat that one. It's a good general seed feeder type of um, food base for a variety of seed feeders like this house finch, the white-crowned sparrow, the tufted titmouse, and the blue jay. And there's different types of seed feeders, like hanging feeders. Some of those promote, many species use hanging feeders, but some prefer platform feeders like doves and other ground foragers. And you can plant native fruit species. There's many different ones, hollies, cedar trees, beautyberries, wax myrtles. All those produce enough fruit and a lot of fruit that is very attractive to birds in the area. And you can provide nectar. You can do it with the trumpet vine and other types of kind of red flowering native plants. But you can also provide hummingbird feeders. And what I do, I have one in my backyard, fourth cup of sugar to 1 cup of hot water so that sugar dissolves. And I replace it frequently because they go sour, especially in the heat within, 5 days. And so you need to replace it. If you start seeing it getting really cloudy, it's too sour and the hummingbird won't drink from it. Here are some other species that you can find during different times of the year, like the ruby-throated hummingbird in the summer, the northern mockingbird all year round, brown thrasher all year round, and the cedar waxwing during the winter, which is a really beautiful bird. You see them high up in the trees. They feed on hollies and cabbage tree fruit, etc. Now you can provide meat. Now, when I say provide meat, I'm not talking about setting out a T-bone steak for different birds, but there are birds that eat other birds or frogs and snakes and small mammals. And these examples are like the loggerhead shrike, the barred owl, and the great horned owl. All of these are um, uh, quote unquote meat eaters or carnivorous birds. The interesting thing about the loggerhead shrike, they're more in open areas like rangeland or pastures. And you can tell if you have them, if you have barbed wire fences and you see little tufts of fur on them, well, what that is a loggerhead shrike has caught a mouse and impaled, sorry to be graphic here, but impaled the mouse onto the barbed wire, and the tuft of fur left over is what is left after the loggerhead shrike had eaten the mouse. So we talked about food. What about cover? Um, in particular, cavities are in short supply in neighborhoods because a lot of people, when they have a dead or dying tree, they cut it all the way down to the base. And there's a lot of species that utilize this. Pileated woodpeckers, hairy woodpeckers, red-bellied woodpeckers, all of them require these dead snags, not only for foraging, but also for nesting. And then you have a whole host of birds that go into the cavities made by these woodpeckers in these dead trees, like the tufted titmouse, the Carolina chickadee, the eastern bluebird, the great crested flycatcher. All of them nest in these cavities. They don't make the cavities themselves, but they utilize the cavities that are made naturally or by woodpeckers. So how can you provide cavities? Well, like I said before, leave a snag on your property. And if you don't have snags, you can provide a nesting box. And those are primarily for secondary cavity nesters. It's really tough to get a woodpecker to use a nest box. Some will, but in the most cases, they like to dig their own cavities. So the nesting boxes that you would provide would be for secondary cavity nesters. So what about cover? Maintain a variety of native plant species and increase vertical height diversity. If you look across their backyard or front yard, you see mowed lawn and tree canopy cover. Try to increase the variety of plants that occur in between those layers. And again, I'm going to say stop mowing. Stop mowing. I've done this. This is my yard. What was it? Geez, 30 years ago, has it been? Something like that. And it's amazing what will come up and the diversity that you get and that succession of plants is very attractive to different species at different times of the year. Well, we talked food cover. What about water? Bird baths are very attractive to a wide variety of species, especially now during this drought. Running water, that sound attracts. You can do little ponds, etc., and you can buy those kits at various hardware stores. Now, the last topic we talk about is space, and that's a little more complicated. Now, we're talking, let's say you want to do a woodpecker or a red-shouldered hawk. How much space is your yard enough that it will have enough items for it to survive throughout its lifetime? So I'll give you examples. So is one tree enough? Is two trees? Or do you need a whole like patch of trees to really attract a particular species of bird? Now, I've done a lot of work research on this over the years. Let me tell you that question is not easy to answer. Trying to determine how big of a patch will attract different species. And to give you kind of a flavor of this, think about a wren, a Carolina wren, and this red-tailed hawk. Now, at the very highest level, when it's making a decision to nest or forage, it's looking at the landscape at a much bigger scale than what the Carolina wren's looking at. The Carolina wren's may be looking at a couple backyards, and then within those backyards, it's looking for a place to put its home range and then to forage in the different patches and even getting down to the various individual twigs and leaves, etc., looking for insects. The red-tailed hawk, though, its home range is way bigger, and you were talking about, cities, portions of cities that attract a red-tailed hawk. So really, it's important to think that larger birds operate at broader scales and require larger patches. Smaller birds, more limited scales and more and smaller patches. So how do you plan for space? Well, be aware of the habitat surrounding your property and plan accordingly. So for example, if you're thinking about the size of bird and you're like, I really want a barred owl. Well, barred owls really like large live oak trees and other oaks. So do you have large live oaks or do you have oaks in the area? Talk with your neighbors. Try to plan bigger. The one thing I've done is at the edges of the property, or the corners of the property, talk to my neighbor and say, hey, how about let's letting it go wild? You take your portion and my portion, and then we make a bigger patch. And experiment. You know, despite everything I say here, wildlife is wildlife. And so you're like, well, I did everything. I haven't attracted this particular species. So try different things and experiment and embrace uncertainty. It's one of those things where a lot of people say, well, if I put up the seed feeder, will I get these species? Well, no, there's a lot of factors that affect whether you find a species within your yard. So, in summary, in this portion of the talk, you got food cover, water, and space for good bird habitat. You think about the different life stages, breeding, wintering, and migration. In particular, I'll talk a little more about stopover sites, and you need food like insects, fruit, nectar, even small animals, and you can provide bird feeders. Think about vertical height diversity. A lot of times, like this picture here, you can see that mowed yard and that one tree. Try to increase the structure between the canopy and the lawn. Water can help to attract species. And think about the bird sizes. For the bigger species, you need to talk with your neighbors and group vegetation across the neighborhood. So, that kind of gives a general overview of what types of factors can attract birds within neighborhoods and yards. But I started asking questions with my students and said, are all treed areas used equally among birds? What about a treed residential area versus an urban forest fragment? So, do different species prefer urban forest fragments versus residential? And I had a student, Ryan, who did this study a number of years ago. He's published two papers out of it. He compared point counts in residential versus nearby urban forest fragments. And he asked the question, what species use these different types of habitats? And he found over 50 species during the breeding season, even some in what we call interior forest species. Interior forest species are birds that tend to need large forest patches in order to breed. But we have found, and I'll discuss more about this, we have found that there are several species in the southeast that utilize small patches in even residential neighborhoods. There are 10 migrants that occurred more often in forest fragments than residential areas. So these tend to be birds that forage under the canopy. So it makes sense that a forest patch has more vertical height diversity. So they're going to more target those urban forest fragments than the residential area because typically you have a mowed lawn versus canopy in residential areas. So I'll give you an example of this, like the ovenbird, those didn't come out very well. The black and white warbler, the other warblers that are high foraging, like the northern parula. Parula is quite often they're very numerous in residential areas. You hear them all the time. They're really hard to see. That's mainly because they're up very high. But for the ovenbird, you need some vertical height structure on the floor too. So another question that another student of mine did was looking, and this was Peggy, and she looked in the literature, summer tanager, the northern parula, and the pileated woodpecker is considered interior forest specialist, but most of these studies were done in the Northeast. And if you're in Gainesville or in any other town, you hear and see tanagers, northern parulas, and pileated woodpeckers in your neighborhood. So it's like, well, what's going on here? So what we did is surveys throughout a couple neighborhoods. We surveyed just around where they were found, looked at vertical height structure around the area that they were foraging, and we compared the structure of front yards and backyards for the distribution of these species. And lo and behold, well, we already kind of knew this. All three species do breed in treed neighborhoods. Now, if you have a neighborhood with no trees, you're not going to find parulas or summer tanagers or pileated woodpeckers. But if you do have trees, and particularly if you have vertical height structure, you're going to get the parulas, the tanagers, and the pileated woodpeckers. So why do they breed readily in Gainesville and other, well, in that study it was in Gainesville, but also in other cities in the Southeast, but not the Northeast? That's where people call them interior forest specialists. Well, to give you an example, the nests of parulas are particularly in epiphytes, like and here in the Southeast, they use Spanish moss that's hanging everywhere on a variety of oaks. The equivalent northern epiphyte that they use to breed in is called beard moss, and that's absent in fragmented areas. It's only in old forests. So here is an example that nesting substrate is very important, and that one species may not breed in the Northeast in residential neighborhoods, but in the Southeast they do. So really, it's that interior forest specialists. Another study I don't have time to talk about, but they can breed, stop over, and have and winter in cities. So, and for planting purposes, both forest fragments and individual trees in cities are important for a variety of species during these different seasons. And increasing vertical height structure in residential areas, in most cases, increases bird diversity. Now, how can you get your neighbors involved? There's a program that started a few years ago called the Neighborhood Natural Area Network, and the idea behind that is creating habitat with your neighbors and doing restoration activities and a lot of educational activities. So, really, the purpose is to raise awareness about the connection of yards to nearby natural areas, how they can enhance wildlife habitat, and it's really to improve communication and management actions to conserve wildlife habitat and natural resources within residential neighborhoods. So, what do NANAN, I guess that's the acronym, do? Well, one of the things they do is they create an iNaturalist project. I can't really see everyone because you're all online, but if you've never used iNaturalist, it's a free app. It helps you identify plant and animal species, and they use this to record and identify species through bioblitzes or learn, and it helps people learn about the local natural heritage. I mean, what is that quote unquote weed growing in the crack of my cement of my driveway? It's very addictive. Pretty soon, once you start naming things, especially kids, they just go bananas and start using iNaturalist everywhere. So you can set up a project as part of the neighborhood network. Here's one. It's Madera. It's a semi-natural residential neighborhood in Gainesville. So far, this is an older snapshot. This is like 5 years old, actually. It's 800, no, more than that. It's 10 years old. 859 observations. They're way above that now. They have 98 observers. And what it is essentially once you take a picture and you upload it, when you make a project, or I'll help you make a project, anybody who uses iNaturalist and uploads it, that photo will become part of that project. In some neighborhoods, they create conservation and restoration activities. They remove invasive exotics. They plant natives in common areas. Some do nature walks. So here's an example of coral ardesia, which is an exotic invasive. And you can see how many bags they removed there out of this one natural forest remnant within the neighborhood. They plant natives. Here's a group that was planting around a stormwater retention pond. And they do bioblitzes. That same group went out in a natural area. They did a bioblitz to record the different types of species that are in the area. So the benefits are multiple. You can learn what other communities are doing. Once you join the network, you can see all the different other communities, what they're doing. It creates more opportunities to learn about local plants and animals, and you can start community projects to improve habitat for local wildlife. And really, one of the neat things is when you do these type of activities, it improves the sense of community. That's what all the residents have told me. They love getting together with neighbors and doing a project together. So if you're interested in joining, that's my email. That's the website, livinggreen.ifasufl.edu, NNAN. And if you're interested in reading more in depth about creating and conserving biodiversity and development, there's a book that I published a number of years back called The Green Leap. And that is the end of my presentation. I'm happy, I guess, Claire, you're gonna not, yeah, you're gonna read off the questions from people.
Yes. So what I wanted to tell everybody is that we have this survey. It's up right now. It's called Neighborhood Natural Area Network Survey. And so if you would like to answer that while we're answering questions, that would be really helpful. There are 6 questions, so make sure to scroll down. Okay, we got a few questions in here. Okay. Um, is there a particular height needed for a snag to be beneficial?
Well, I can say there's not a particular height. I would just say taller the better. So, um, again, wildlife is wildlife, so I can't say, 10 feet is the best or 15 feet, depending on the species and depending on the individual, they will use different sections of taller and taller snags. Now, you want to do the snag so it doesn't, if it does, although I have done snags way taller than my roof, and the tree arborist said, well, it's just going to rot away and not hit your roof. It's because it's leaning away from your roof. So you just have to be careful what type of snag you do. But even a small snag, when it starts to rot away, you'll see pileated woodpeckers use it. So any type of snag is beneficial.
Okay. How can we balance having a bird bath and not creating stagnant water that breeds mosquitoes?
So that is a more difficult question. What I recommend for water or bird baths is clean them out regularly with a little bit of bleach. So like 1 to 10, 1 part bleach to 10 parts water. Clean those out every now and then. That helps reduce the amount of, well, not only organic matter, but disease sometimes can be transmitted between birds. So that's very helpful to use that. Sometimes running water, like the little pond things you put in a bird path, that motion helps limit the amount of mosquito larvae that you have. So that's another option. But I would just recommend cleaning it out once a week.
Yeah, I'm thinking I want to get a sprinkler, a bird sprinkler, a little mister,
Mhm.
so they can come over and have a little bath over there. Okay, so we have someone said this was Charlotte said any chance of adding a word counter to track how many times you said native species in this webinar. Hopefully it was enough that everybody gets the message and how important it really is. And so with FFL, a lot of times what we talk about is the right plant for the right place in your landscaping. That if it's native and it's in the right place, awesome. If it's not native and it's in the right place, awesome. It won't need as much water, it won't need as much fertilizer, it won't need as much pesticides. But with wildlife, it's a little different, isn't it? If you want to attract wildlife.
Well, no, I mean the native plants is the number one priority to attract wildlife. So the
Right,
right plant in the right place, if it's native, that's um, it will benefit wildlife. Now,
right.
exotic plants, you have to be careful because some require a lot of water and fertilizer, and you can have what we call secondary impacts. So if you use a lot of water and fertilizer, well, you're going to have a lot of runoff of nutrients into nearby wetlands and water bodies that impact wetlands that ultimately impacts wildlife. The other thing is hybridization. So some exotics, there's a threat of hybridizing with the native plants, and so you don't have that native plant genetics. It gets swamped out by the exotic. So examples of that is like I had it at the tip of my tongue, and now I forget. Like the hybridizing with oh shoot, it'll come to me. But there are there are examples of plants that you wanted to stay away from that could potentially hybridize with native plants and swamp out the genetics.
Okay, good to know. All right. We had a few questions about squirrels. I've given up feeding the birds with birdseed because of the squirrels. Do we have any suggestions?
Um, if you can do it, the best way is to well, anyone can do it. Get a shepherd's hook, get one of those baffles that are round, not the like a little upside down pie plate. Not that. It's a round cylinder and
Mm,
it's big enough that it attaches on the shepherd's hook and it's slick enough that they can't get up there. So I've used that and it's pretty yeah, it's pretty and even raccoons can't get of it. So
we
that's one
had,
way.
oh, go
Another
ahead.
way is to hang the feeder 10 to 15 feet away from any tree that a squirrel can't jump on. Although I've seen squirrels, if the line is thick enough, they go down the line and get on this, onto the feeder. They're very adaptable. So even with the I've seen squirrels do this, even with the baffles that are hard for them to get up, they'll hit the thing, the jump on them, and they'll shake the feeder if it's a platform feeder, and it'll knock some of the seed on the ground. So you're always going to get lose a little bit to the squirrels.
Okay, so Monica says, I've never seen hummingbirds in my area in Manatee County. Are they common to find in this area, but not in my backyard?
They're very common in Manatee County. Again, that's if you think about the food cover water space, if there's particularly during the breeding season, even though they love the sugar water, they use that. I mean, if you watch a hummingbird, they're constantly in motion. They need that energy, but they actually feed and utilize insects for their young because the young need protein, and they also use spider webs to make their nests. So if you've removed all your spiders and you've sprayed everything with no insects, you're not going to see any hummingbirds in the area.
Okay. Let's see. We had a few questions about palm trees. Do palm trees support bird habitat, and can you use a snag of a palm that, like a palm that has died, would that attract birds for habitat too?
Um, that's an interesting question. One of the things that I have done over the years is I call it Save the Beards campaign. So before the tree's dead, a lot of people trim these cabbage palms or other palms to have that little tuft at the top. But when those palm fronds die or get brown and they fall over, that beard is habitat for birds, bats, and a variety of species. So I would recommend before the tree dies, save those beards. Don't trim up those trees. Let those beards uh, grow and you provide more habitat. Now, once the palm dies, I do think it's good habitat for a lot of insects, which again would provide food for birds. But I've never really seen a cavity be made in a cabbage tree. I just think it's now, as soon as I say that, I'm sure there's some examples of that out there. But for food, yeah, a snag of a cabbage palm would be fine.
Okay. This is particularly relevant to Gainesville right now. Does any bird eat love bugs?
Nope.
For everyone that is not in Gainesville, we are getting swarmed by love bugs right now. They are all over my house. They're all everywhere. So that's an issue, huh?
Yeah. So this is the introduced love bug from South America. We have a native one. Um, Nearctica is the exotic one. And it's just this year, it's funny. Every year it's like any species, they have population variation across the years. This is a perfect year for them for whatever reason. They come out in huge numbers and they have that little orange um, coloration on their thorax, right between their head and their abdomen. And that's a warning coloration because they don't taste good and
Mm.
nothing really eats them. So people are like, oh, those crazy love bugs, what can I do? Well, I just wax my car and put on Rain-X or something like that on my windshield to help with the love bugs. Now, if you're interested, I don't know, I'm going out on a limb here. Years ago, I wrote a book on how to identify the insect splats on your windshield. It's called That Gunk on Your Car. It went crazy for a while, but it's now out of print. However, there's an app you can get if you have an iPhone. It's free. Just look up That Gunk on your car or just that gunk. And you can put that on there. There's even a game for your kids to play with. You can identify all those insect splats.
Okay, I have two mosquito questions. So they're kind of related. Pretty soon, the mosquito spray trucks will be out. Does the spray kill a lot of the insects that birds need? Does it actually help to have them not spray as they drive by your house?
Yes and yes.
Okay,
So,
so
so yeah, they're spraying, and it is going to kill more than just the uh, mosquitoes, and they tend to spray closer to night, at least they're supposed to, because of the bees are really susceptible to that spray, and they're, underground or hidden during the night. So yeah, that is going to impact the number of insects.
and how do you ask them not to spray at your house? You just call the county or utilities or something?
I think you can, and every county is a little different. They may just not spray your yard, and then they
Mm-hmm.
spray their neighbors. So you're going to get drift no matter what. So
Right.
you have to get with
And
your
then
neighbors.
yeah, well, that's a great point, is that if you there are a lot of things that you can accomplish if you get your neighbors together. The follow-up question to that was, are mosquito dunks okay for wildlife in your yard? And if y'all don't know, mosquito dunk
Mhm.
is a bucket that you fill with water and some organic material, and then you put this special, like it's like a block that you put in there
Mhm.
that's poison, and it dissolves in there. And when the mosquitoes lay their larvae in there, the larvae
Yeah.
die.
Yeah,
So what
those
do you
are
think about
okay.
those? Those are
Those are
cool?
okay. Yeah, and there's
Okay.
all the ones you can put in your pond too, those little discs that float around. It's very specific to mosquito larvae. And it's not a
Okay.
poison, it's a can't remember exactly what it is. Is it a hormone? I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's only specific to mosquitoes.
Okay. So we had a few questions about HOAs. And if you live in an HOA, how can you implement some of these tips that you have been talking about? So do you have any suggestions? And if you don't, then I do.
Well, I can give you a spread of actions. One being that you got to get your neighbors involved in accepting what you're going to do. If they accept it, then the one neighbor that complains to the HOA, you can say, well, these 10 other neighbors are supporting what I do. So that's one way to do it to help head that off. Another is what I say is some research that's been done. It's called cues to care. So the idea is if you want your front yard to go wild, you have to put enough cues in there that's showing you're caring for it. So you might have an area that's going a little wild, but you have a trim hedge in front of it or a little bit of turf grass to accentuate that wild area. So put in more of those cues that you're still caring for the property, but you've let portions of it go wild. And then probably the third thing I would say is right now, and of course, is a law mean anything? If you say that you are doing it for environmental reasons, making your yard go wild, and you have an HOA that has a law that has some regulation against that, the state law supersedes the homeowner law. So you can actually go wild on your property with those things. However, I would recommend instead of going to that point, get your neighbors involved and try to excuse the care to make it more palatable to your neighbors and the
Yeah.
HOA.
So the FFL law that has to do with HOAs is that you may not be prohibited from doing something that's Florida friendly. Your HOA cannot prohibit that. However, you still have to follow your HOA's rules. So if the HOA says, like one of these comments in here said, no bird feeders in the front yard, you still have to follow that rule, but you have to put it in your backyard. No one's going to report you in your backyard, hopefully. And so some of these things that do attract wildlife, they might have to be in the backyard to follow your HOA's rules. And then some of these things too, with, I love the cues to care. If you have a list of plants that those are the only plants that you can plant in your neighborhood, but they are Florida friendly, then unfortunately your HOA is following the law. I would say probably the best opportunity for people is probably the backyard for a lot of this stuff. But if you want to see more wildlife in your neighborhood, in your common spaces, or in people's yards, you do have to get together with your neighbors. Your HOA is made up of people. Your HOA, you pay to be in the HOA, and so you should have a say of what happens in the HOA. I'm putting a link in the chat right now. This is our FFL resources for communities. So if you'd like to see what we have there, we have model language that can be used in your architectural guidelines. We have things that you can bring to your landscaping committee and say, look, we need to stop irrigating with these kind of irrigation heads. We need to stop applying fertilizer at these amounts. We need to start having native areas for our pollinators and wildlife, and we can change the rules. Rules are just rules and they can be changed. Some are harder to be changed than others, but it is possible, especially with the architectural guidelines or your landscaping guidelines. So that is something that you can get together with your neighbors with. You can call your county extension agent to make a presentation to your HOA board or your landscaping committee, and you have a lot of opportunities. And it might be harder for sure. And then we also have a link in here in the chat to find your local county extension agent, because almost every county has an FFL agent that's an expert on the subject matter, and they love making presentations. They need to make presentations, and they love talking to the public about this kind of stuff. So get in touch with Extension. We're gonna do a couple more questions. We have question about crows and blackbirds. I'm not sure if the blackbirds are the same as crows. Well, I know we have red-winged blackbirds, but I just said we have blackbirds at my feeder and they're scaring away the other birds. And we have a crow that's made her home in my backyard. Is this a desirable bird to have, or can it scare the other birds away? What do we know about crows?
Again, it's personal preference. I love crows personally, and
I think they're cool.
I love red-winged blackbirds. So, I mean, that's fine. I mean, that's just, and they may scare, especially when a grackle or red-winged blackbirds descend upon a feeder. There's not going to be anything else there for a while, but they eventually go away, and other birds get their chance.
Somebody asked, what is a good medium-sized tree to attract wildlife to your yard? Can you think of a few that would work well in North Central and South Florida, or at least a couple that work well where we are?
There's so many. I mean, any holly, native holly. Sweet gum is a good one for seed. Uh, Geez, there's so many. I would just say the diversity. So if you do a few like Eastern Black holly, then do another type of holly. So try different types. And really, there is several online resources that gives you the area and your soil to help get which plant will work best in your area.
We have the FFL Plant app. I just put the link to that in the chat box. You can use this on your phone or you can use it on your computer and your browser. And you can you can filter out, would I want a medium-sized plant or a shrub? I want it to be native. I want it to work in this zone. I want it to work in this type of soil. Show me some options. And so that is another option to kind of browse some of the plants that we have that in our state that do really work to attract wildlife, and you can also just filter it down to make it a little less overwhelming. Maybe you get like five choices instead of dozens. I like it when my choices are narrowed down for me. So I'm gonna ask one more question. Let's look. Are bee-friendly systemic insecticides toxic to birds? And what alternatives are there to prevent insect damage? Maybe we can talk about pesticides. Let's talk about pesticides and cats, and then that'll be the end of our question and answer session here.
So yeah, pesticides are not most of them insecticides are not species specific, so it affects everything, particularly bees. So in those type of situations, I would recommend spot treat, but even spot treatment, I mean, it's a flowering bush or something like that, it's going to affect the bees. So I would highly recommend limiting any pesticide use if you want. Um, and there's what, 60 species of bees around there, 60, 68 species of bees in Florida. Kind of interesting. When I was out in Arizona, I was doing research on bees, and there was close to 1,000 different bee species. The reason why there's so many in the desert versus in Florida is that many of them were ground nesters, and with limited rain, they do quite well there. And so, what's the cat question?
Tell us about feral cats. Tell us about outside cats.
Well, we have a fact sheet on that. If you could Google that and look up, dude. Okay, so am I going to get controversial? Yes. So for me, I have two cats. Keeping cats indoors is the best policy. That's the most pet-friendly way you can do it because the cats live long, healthy lives and they don't impact the environment. What do you do about feral cats? Well, trap, neuter, release programs do not work. There's many research that shows that they don't work and they just promote the problem. So I would not recommend any trap, neuter, release program in your area.
Okay, so let's, before the cat people get angry, best practice for wildlife, keep your cats inside.
And it's the
Best
best
pra
practice for your cat as well.
And the best practice for your cat. So consider that if you want birds in your yard, you're probably not going to get a ton of birds in your yard if you have an outdoor cat that is preying on birds. And then I just wanted to, before we get off here, I wanted to go ahead and, well, first of all, remind everybody about that poll that popped up. If y'all could, if I don't know if that's still showing, but um, for insecticides, pesticides, we always recommend that you use the least toxic pesticide first. So that really includes horticultural oils. That includes insecticidal soap. That means going out and, just picking off the branches that are affected. You can prune them, you can remove the leaves. You can do physical controls like traps and things like that for pests before you go out with these broad spectrum pesticides. Broad spectrum means it kills any insect it gets in contact with, or it can kill any insect it gets in contact with. So that includes weed and feed for your yard. If you're doing weed and feed, some of them include um, pesticides in them, some of them include fungicides in them, some of them include herbicides in them. So we just recommend that you don't use these combination products. And if you do feel like you have reached a threshold where the pests are doing inexorable damage to your pet, to your plants, then you spot treat those areas and try not to use pesticides on flowering plants. We also have in the chat, we found the publication about feral cats and wildlife. That is also in the chat. Oh, and this is the last thing before we go. What was the website that you were mentioning in your presentation so everybody can write that down right now? What was it called, Manan?
It's Neighborhood Natural Area Network. So if you just Google
Okay.
Neighborhood Natural Area Network, IFAS, it will come up.
Okay. Natural area, because I would love to do that in my neighborhood. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a really informative presentation. Everyone, this will be posted on our FFL YouTube later, the recording of it will. If you had any specific questions, you can email me and I can pass them on. I'll put my email in the chat too. It's Claire77@UFL. And thank you so much for joining us,
Yeah.
and we will see you at the next webinar.